There is something inside you that has never been conditioned, something that no belief system, no trauma, no story about yourself has ever managed to touch. The Gnostic texts buried at Nag Hammadi in 1945 described it with unusual clarity. They called it the pneuma, the spark, the uncreated witness, and they explained in symbolic detail why most people live their entire lives without ever becoming aware of it. You were taught to look outward, to build yourself from borrowed images, to secure your identity through achievement, through roles, through the eyes of others. This is not accidental, it is structural. The Gnostics described forces they called Archons, not as literal demons, but as patterns of consciousness that feed on your forgetting. They sustain themselves through your identification with what you are not, your job, your opinions, your wounds, your resume of selfhood. But underneath all of that constructed identity, there is something they described as untouchable, not because it hides, but because it exists prior to the entire game of self-definition. It does not negotiate, it does not defend, it does not improve, it simply is. And the moment you recognize it, something shifts, not in your circumstances, in the axis of your awareness. The texts were hidden for nearly 2,000 years. When they surfaced, they revealed a psychology of liberation that religious institutions had worked to erase, not because it was heretical, but because it could not be controlled. It pointed to a dimension of self that requires no mediator, no doctrine, no permission. This is not about belief, it is about recognition. And the question the texts pose is simple but uncomfortable. What if the life you are defending is not actually yours? The Gnostics spoke of a process they called pneuma, emptiness, not the fertile void from which things arise, but a hollow imitation of being, a world built from reflected light, not source. In psychological terms, this describes the condition of living entirely from conditioned response. You react, you defend, you perform, but somewhere along the way, the one who is aware of all this became invisible to you. This forgetting is not a mistake. It is a mechanism. From the moment you are born, you are trained to locate yourself in images, in stories, in comparisons. You learn that you are your name, your history, your preferences. These accumulate into a structure the Gnostics called the psyche, the self constructed from the world's materials. And this self is always vulnerable, always incomplete, always requiring validation from outside itself. The Archons, in the texts, are described as beings who cannot create. They can only imitate. They manipulate, distort, and bind consciousness to form. In symbolic language, this describes the forces within your own awareness that insist you are only what you have been told you are. Your conditioning speaking as if it were you. Your wounds demanding to be your identity. Your achievements pretending to be your worth. And here is the trap. The more you defend this constructed self, the more solid it feels. The more you identify with your story, the more you forget that you are the one reading it. Not the character, not the plot, the awareness itself. The Gnostics were not describing a cosmic battle. They were mapping the interior struggle between the conditioned and the unconditioned, the formed and the formless, the self you were taught and the awareness that was never born. And they left instructions on how to find the difference. You have been assembling yourself piece by piece since childhood. Every compliment, every criticism, every moment you were told what you were or were not, these became the material of your self-concept. The Gnostics described this process with unsettling precision. They said the Archons rule through naming, through definition, through the assignment of identity. In the Gospel of Philip, there is a line that cuts through centuries of philosophy in a single breath. A name given to the worldly is a great deception, for it distracts from what is firm to what is not firm. You are not your name, but you have been conditioned to respond as if you are. You are not your resume of accomplishments, but you defend it as if your being depended on it. This is the structure of archontic consciousness. It convinces you that you are the mask, that the performance is the performer, that the wave is separate from the ocean, and once you accept this, you enter a state of constant need. You need to be seen correctly, to be understood, to be validated, because the self you are defending is not actually real. It is a constellation of memories, projections, and inherited beliefs. But beneath this, untouched by any of it, is what the texts call the divine spark. Not divine in the religious sense, divine in the sense of uncreated, uncontaminated, prior to interpretation. It is not something you achieve, it is what you are before the achieving began. The Archons cannot touch this, not because it is protected, but because it exists in a dimension they do not recognize. They operate through form, through image, through the realm of reaction and identification. The pneuma exists prior to all of that. It is the silent witness, the awareness that sees the entire structure, including the one who thinks it is you. And the question becomes, can you find it before the structure collapses on its own? There is a recurring image in the Nag Hammadi texts, a veil, a covering that obscures the light without extinguishing it. The Archons do not destroy consciousness, they obscure it. They keep you looking at the surface, mistaking reflection for source. In modern terms, this is distraction, not the trivial kind, the existential kind. You are kept busy maintaining the self, defending it, improving it, narrating it. And this maintenance becomes the substance of your inner life. You wake up thinking about what needs to be done, what was said, what might happen. The stream of self-reference is so constant that you assume it is you. But it is not. It is the mechanism of capture. The Gnostics describe this as sleep, not literal unconsciousness, but a waking trance in which you are identified with processes that do not belong to you. Your thoughts feel like yours, but most of them are inherited. Your emotions feel personal, but they are often learned responses, conditioned reactions, looping through the same neural pathways they have traced for years. And the Archons symbolically feed on this, not because they are separate entities, but because the structure of identification sustains itself through your investment. The more you believe you are the thinker, the more thoughts arise to confirm it. The more you identify with being wounded, the more the wound speaks as if it were you. But there is a gap, a space between the thought and the awareness of the thought, between the emotion and the one who notices it. This gap is not empty. It is the only real ground you have. The texts describe it as the pleroma, fullness. Not fullness in the sense of accumulation, but fullness in the sense of sufficiency, completeness prior to need. The Archons cannot enter this space, because it is not a space they can colonize. It has no form to manipulate. And this is where the real question begins. At some point the structure cracks, not because you force it, but because it was never sustainable. The meanings you borrowed stop working. The identity you built stops feeling true. The story you told yourself about who you are begins to feel like someone else's script. The Gnostics called this moment Gnosis, not knowledge in the intellectual sense, recognition, a sudden seeing through the veil. It often arrives through crisis, through loss, through the failure of the very things you were told would make you whole. Your career does not complete you. Your relationships, no matter how genuine, do not fill the gap. Your achievements accumulate into a resume that feels strangely hollow when you look at it alone at night. And the question forms quietly at first, then with increasing pressure. Who am I when none of this is present? This is the question the Archons cannot survive, because they exist only in the realm of constructed meaning. They require your belief in the story, your investment in the image. The moment you withdraw that investment, even slightly, the entire architecture becomes transparent. You see it as a system, and you realize, with startling clarity, that you are not inside the system. You are the space in which the system appears. The texts describe this as remembering, not remembering a past event, but remembering what you are prior to all events. The pneuma does not have a history. It does not evolve or improve. It is complete in itself, always, regardless of circumstance. It is the still point, the unchanging witness, the awareness that remains when everything else dissolves. And here is the paradox. The moment you recognize it, you realize it was never absent. It was always there. You were always this. The entire struggle to become something was a distraction from what you already are. But recognition is not the same as stabilization. The Archons in the texts are described as jealous, not in the petty sense, but in a structural sense. They want your attention. They need it, because attention is the substance through which the constructed self is maintained. Every time you identify with a thought, you feed the structure. Every time you react from a wound, you solidify the pattern, and the pattern wants to continue. This is not about morality. It is about mechanics. The conditioned mind operates through repetition. It runs the same loops, defends the same positions, reacts from the same triggers, and it does this so smoothly that you assume it is you making the choices. But the Gnostics saw through this. They recognized that most of what appears as self-directed behavior is actually conditioned response pretending to be agency. And the battleground is attention. Where you place your awareness determines what you energize. If you place it in the story of yourself, the story grows more complex. If you place it in the wound becomes your identity. If you place it in the need to be seen, understood, validated, you will spend your life performing for an audience that is also performing for you. But if you place it in the awareness itself, something shifts. The witness does not engage in the drama. It sees the drama. It does not defend the self. It observes the mechanisms of defense. And in that observation, there is a kind of freedom the texts describe as liberation. Not freedom from circumstances, freedom from the belief that you are only what circumstances have made you. This is the one thing the Archons cannot touch, not because it resists them, but because it is not in the game they are playing. It is prior to the game. It is the ground on which the game appears, and the moment you recognize this ground, you are no longer fully bound by the rules. But recognition is fragile, and the pull back into identification is constant. The pneuma does not eliminate the psyche. It reveals it. You still have a personality, you still have memories, preferences, wounds. The constructed self does not disappear, but it is no longer mistaken for the totality of what you are, and this distinction changes everything. The Gnostics did not advocate for the destruction of the world or the abandonment of the self. They advocated for a shift in axis, a reversal of priority. You stop living from the constructed identity and start living from the awareness that holds it. The image of yourself becomes a tool, not a prison. The story becomes something you can step into and out of, rather than something you are trapped inside. But the pull to re-identify is powerful. The Archons symbolically wait at the threshold. The moment you forget yourself, the moment you slip back into pure reaction, the structure reasserts itself. You become the wound again. You become the need again. You become the defended, fragile self that requires constant maintenance. And this is where most people spend their lives, oscillating between brief moments of clarity and long stretches of identification. The texts describe this as the cycle of return, not reincarnation in the literal sense, but the repetition of the same patterns within a single lifetime. You think you have moved forward, but you are running the same script with different actors. The pneuma does not grow or improve, but your access to it can be stabilized through attention, through the practice of returning again and again to the witness, not as a meditative technique, but as a lived orientation. You learn to notice when you have collapsed into the story, and you learn to step back, not with force, but with the simple recognition that you are not the story. You are the one aware of it. This is not a one-time event. It is a continuous practice, and the cost of forgetting is higher than most people realize. When you live entirely from the constructed self, you repeat. You repeat the same relationships with different people. You repeat the same conflicts with different triggers. You repeat the same wounds, dressed in new circumstances. And you do this unconsciously, believing each time that this time is different. The Gnostics called this the domain of the Archons, the realm of mechanical repetition disguised as free will. You think you are choosing, but you are reenacting the same defenses, the same needs, the same strategies for survival that stopped working years ago, but continue to run because no one has questioned them. This is the existential weight the texts point to. Not sin, not punishment, just the slow exhaustion of living a life that is not actually yours. And most people never notice. They accept the repetition as normal. They call it personality. They call it human nature. They defend it as authenticity. But the Gnostics saw it as a form of entrapment, not imposed by an external force, but maintained by the refusal to become aware, the refusal to look at the machinery of self. This is where the question becomes urgent. How much of your life is actually lived? How much is simply performed from script? How many of your reactions are yours, And how many are inherited, conditioned, replayed from a template you were handed in childhood? And more importantly, what happens when you begin to see the difference? The pneuma does not rescue you from the repetition. It reveals the repetition. And in that revelation, you are given a choice you did not know you had. You can continue the pattern, or you can interrupt it, not with effort, but with awareness. By simply noticing that the pattern is running, you introduce a gap, and in that gap something else becomes possible, but the gap closes quickly if you are not vigilant. And this is the real work the texts describe. There is a moment in every life where the question can no longer be avoided. Not the question of what to do, but the question of who is doing it, who is making the decisions, who is reacting, who is defending. And when you look closely with real honesty, the answer is often uncomfortable. You find conditioning, you find patterns, you find a self assembled from fragments that were never chosen, only accepted. The Archons, in symbolic language, are the guardians of this threshold. They do not want you to see past the constructed self, not because they are malevolent, but because their existence depends on your identification. The moment you recognize the pneuma, the moment you stabilize in the awareness that is prior to the story, their influence collapses. Not dramatically, quietly, like waking from a dream and realizing the urgency you felt a moment ago was never real. But the threshold is also the point of greatest resistance. The closer you get to recognition, the louder the conditioning becomes, the more insistent the thoughts, the more convincing the story. You are pulled back into the drama, into the narrative of yourself, into the belief that if you just solve this one problem, fix this one thing, achieve this one goal, then you will finally be at peace. The Gnostics understood this. They knew the mind would offer 1,000 distractions before it allowed you to see through it. And they knew that recognition, when it comes, is not a result of effort. It is a collapse of effort, a sudden release of the need to maintain the structure. You stop defending, you stop performing, and in that stopping you find what was always there. But recognition is not stability, and the question the texts leave you with is not rhetorical. How long will you continue to defend a self that was never real? The Nag Hammadi texts were buried because they could not be controlled. They pointed to something that required no institution, no priesthood, no mediating authority. They pointed to the pneuma, the uncreated awareness, the one thing that cannot be conditioned, cannot be manipulated, cannot be bought or earned or taken away. And they left no instructions for what to do with this recognition, because there is nothing to do. The entire structure of doing belongs to the psyche, to the self that believes it must become something in order to be complete. But the pneuma is already complete. It does not seek, it does not strive, it simply is. This is not passivity, it is presence. The capacity to see the mechanisms of identification without being pulled into them, to feel the pull of the story without becoming the story, to live with the constructed self while knowing you are not reducible to it. And this knowing changes the quality of everything, not what you do, but the axis from which you do it. The Archons cannot touch this, not because it is hidden, but because it is too simple to colonize, too obvious to weaponize, too immediate to defer. It is here, now, in the space between this sentence and the awareness that reads it, in the stillness beneath the noise of thought, in the silence that remains when all the defending stops. The texts do not promise salvation. They do not offer comfort. They offer recognition, and with it a question that cannot be unasked. You have spent your life becoming someone, but what if you are already what you were looking for, and the search itself was the only thing in the way?